I can still clearly remember the night everything began to fall apart. He left the house wearing the team's jersey, swearing he was meeting his friends to play soccer. Up until then, everything seemed normal, like so many other Fridays. But then an unexpected notification arrived on my phone. It was his Uber receipt, automatically sent to my email. The address, however, wasn't the soccer field. My heart raced instantly. I stared at that screen as if it were a puzzle I didn't want to solve. The ride had ended in front of a building in a neighborhood that wasn't even part of our social circle. There was no reason for him to be there. I knew something was wrong, but at the same time, I tried to deny it to myself. It was as if my mind was trying to shield me from the truth. I got out of bed, paced the house in silence, and felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. It couldn't be real. But that screenshot was the first concrete crack in the perfect facade he always displayed. I had no doubt. My life was about to change completely. The Uber didn't just show a different address. It showed the beginning of the decline. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone still in hand, reading that address over and over. It was as if my heart insisted on believing there was an error, a glitch in the system. But the longer I stared at the screen, the more the truth seemed to leap before my eyes. The man who claimed to love me, who swore fidelity, was somewhere else. I began to remember our routine, almost like a movie playing fast and fast in my mind. The breakfasts filled with laughter, the family trips, the nights we fell asleep side by side. It felt like I was reliving a life that might never have truly existed. He had created an illusion, and I was the naive protagonist in this play. Our marriage had always been full of rituals. He would come home from work, leave his shoes in the same corner, and hug me as if the world outside were too heavy. I believed in this gesture, believed in the loving messages he sent in the middle of the workday. Everything seemed solid, but now I realized they were mechanical gestures, well-practiced performances. I remembered the day he promised me, in front of our family, that it would be the two of us against the world. Words spoken solemnly, with looks of pride all around. How many people applauded that speech, believing every syllable? I believed it too. Today, those phrases echoed like mockery, as if they were the basis of a cruel lie. In that moment, the memory of his laughter pierced me like a blade. I no longer knew how to differentiate the man who made me laugh from the man who lied blatantly. The two versions blurred together, and this doubt gnawed at my soul. Had he ever been true to me? Or had I always been just a backdrop for his double life? As I held my phone, I thought about the small changes I'd already noticed. Him taking his time in the shower, clothes that came back with a scent that wasn't mine, messages deleted from my phone too quickly. I wanted to believe it was work stress, that I was creating too many theories. Now, everything made sense. Anger began to mix with a kind of coldness. I knew I was about to discover a devastating truth, and I needed strength. I couldn't let my emotions blind me. I needed to observe closely, record every detail, prepare myself to face a dirty game he'd been playing for a long time. The most painful part was thinking about all the times I'd defended his honor. When someone insinuated something, I always said, "My husband is different. He's trustworthy." I'd become an unwitting accomplice, protecting a traitor with my own words. The weight of this shame burned me inside. But there was something bigger going on. I wasn't just facing marital betrayal. I was facing a revelation that could change my story, my outlook on love, and even myself. Because when someone deceives us, they don't just steal our trust. They also steal the image we've built of who we are with that person. I closed my eyes and remembered the first time he said, "I love you," to me. It was simple. It was beautiful. It felt true. Today, that memory was like broken glass. It still shone, but it cut. How could such a powerful phrase lose all its power when confronted with a blatant lie? As I took a deep breath, I remembered our children. How could I tell them that the man they called a hero had feet of clay? How could I explain that that welcoming smile hid shameful secrets? I still had no answers, but I knew I needed to protect those who had nothing to do with this filth. The silence in the house that night was deafening. I could hear the distant noise of the street, the wind hitting the window, but inside me there was an echoing emptiness. It was the sound of trust crumbling. Part of me wanted to cry, scream, break everything. But the other part, cold and calculating, said, "Wait. Watch. Collect evidence." I got up and went to the closet. I grabbed his jacket, and the strange scent was still there. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and certainty sank in. I wasn't imagining anything. This was real, and I held more than suspicions. I held fragments of truth that, together, would form the definitive proof. With each detail, his image faded within me. The husband, the friend, the companion of so many years. It was like watching a painting being washed away by the rain until only meaningless smudges remained. I no longer saw a partner, but a stranger who shared my bed and my memories. And yet, the thought of confronting him weighed heavily. Because the confrontation wasn't just about him, it was about me, about admitting that an entire life could have been built on a lie. The fear of facing this truth almost paralyzed me, but fate had already shown there was no turning back. I picked up my journal and began to write, as if it were a way to keep from going mad. I wrote about the Uber, about the perfume, about the suspicious messages. Each word on paper was a building block in my courage. I needed to organize the facts so as not to get lost in the labyrinth of emotion. In that moment, I realized that my version of events also needed to be preserved. He could try to turn the tables, call me paranoid, manipulate me as he always did. But with the evidence in hand, I would have the truth on my side. And no lie could resist that. I thought about how he would react if confronted. His pale face, his trembling voice, his improvised excuses. I could almost picture the scene. And for the first time that night, a strange sensation ran through me. It wasn't pain. It was a silent anticipation of victory. Because deep down, I knew. Those who lie will eventually stumble. Those who deceive will eventually be swallowed by their own web. And he had already taken the first false step by underestimating me. By believing I would close my eyes forever. That was his greatest weakness. With each passing second, I understood better. My life would never be the same again. I was no longer the naive wife who believed everything. I was becoming a different woman. More attentive, stronger, more relentless. And his downfall would be the trigger for my transformation. And as the night wore on, with the proof printed on my phone, a certainty grew within me. There was still much more to discover. Because if that address hid secrets, I needed to be ready to face each one. And what came next could be even more devastating. The next morning, I woke with heavy eyes and a burning mind. The previous night felt like a nightmare, but the Uber notification was still there, like an indelible digital scar. He came home acting normal, smiling, asking about my sleep. I watched him silently, every gesture seemingly rehearsed. Nothing escaped my notice. As he got ready for work, I noticed he was humming softly. It bothered me deeply, as if it were the soundtrack to his deception. How could someone be so lighthearted after spending the entire night hiding a secret? I smiled back, but inside my heart was beating like a storm. At breakfast, he'd talked about the game in fabricated detail. He mentioned goals, passes, even an argument with a friend on the field. Every word was a knife. I knew none of that had happened, and yet, I let him talk, like someone giving someone rope to hang themselves. My eyes searched for signs. The shirt he'd said he'd worn was too clean. His sneakers weren't marked by mud, like every other Friday. His body didn't look tired. He was an actor, poorly rehearsing his role, unaware that I was paying attention to every detail. When he left for work, the house was plunged into silence. I took a deep breath, opened my computer, and began reviewing my previous Uber rides. I discovered a pattern. Almost every Friday, a different address, always in the same neighborhood. It was a secret routine, hidden behind the word soccer. My stomach churned and a part of me wanted to close the screen, pretend I hadn't seen it, but it was too late for that. Each recorded race was like a stamp on his conviction. I wasn't just facing a slip-up. It was a carefully constructed parallel life. At that moment, I decided I needed to dig deeper. Suspicions or loose evidence weren't enough. I wanted the full picture. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. And to do that, I would have to become an investigator of my own life, someone who watches without being noticed. I grabbed my phone and began to observe his schedule. I wrote down appointments, delays, excuses. I created a kind of secret diary where every detail became a clue. I felt fear, yes. But along with the fear came a strength I didn't recognize. I was transforming into someone who no longer accepted living in the shadow of lies. That night, when he arrived, I noticed the smell. It wasn't soccer sweat, it was a sweet, lingering perfume. He kissed me on the forehead, as he always did, but for me that gesture lost all meaning. I only thought about how his body carried signs of another presence. I sat on the couch and watched him fiddling with his phone, always careful, always hiding the screen from me. He pretended to be responding to coworkers, but I knew it was her. Whoever it was, she was already occupying a space between us. A space that grew larger every day, pushing me out of our own home. In the early hours of the morning, while he slept, I felt the weight of the silence. I went to the closet and grabbed another one of his shirts. The scent was there again, lingering like an invisible signature. I closed my eyes and held the fabric tightly. The pain was real, but it was also the proof I needed. I remembered the times he'd say, "You're the woman of my life." How many of those phrases were uttered after one of those outings? Did he look me in the eye and lie as naturally as he breathed? This doubt was more painful than any physical betrayal. Heart racing, I decided I would no longer be a passive spectator. I had to plan, observe every move until I was ready to act. Revenge would not be made of impulses. It would be made of tests, strategy, and coldness. And when the moment came, he'd have nowhere to run. I started following his social media with a fresh eye. Likes at odd times, discreet comments, deleted messages. Digital media always leaves traces, even for those who think they're smart. And each trace was another piece in the puzzle I was putting together. I also began to notice his excuses. Last-minute meeting. Game delayed. Horrible traffic. Everything was starting to sound repetitive, rehearsed. I just nodded, as if I believed it. But inside, I was already a few steps ahead, waiting for the moment when all the pieces would fall into place. My biggest challenge was to remain calm, to smile when I wanted to scream, to cook for him when I wanted to throw the dishes at the wall, to hug him when I wanted to push him away. But this disguise was necessary. It was the price to find out the whole truth. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. The woman who once believed in promises now wore a firmer, colder gaze. I was changing. Not by choice, but by necessity. Because those who are betrayed and decide to fight are never the same again. And the more I observed, the more I understood I was dealing with someone dangerous. Not through violence, but through manipulation. He had the power to turn the tables with sweet words, to make any lie seem true. But now, with proof in hand, that power was beginning to crumble. That night, before bed, I picked up my phone and looked at the screenshots of the races once more. The glow of the screen illuminated my face and reminded me of one thing. His mask had already fallen, at least to me. And when I decided to expose that truth, nothing would save him. And it was in that silence, in the middle of the night, that I realized something even darker. If each race ended at the same address, it was because there was much more hidden behind that door. And I knew that, sooner or later, I would have to cross it myself. On Saturday, he woke up earlier than usual, saying he was meeting friends for coffee. The excuse sounded so flimsy it almost made me laugh. Coffee with friends on a Saturday morning? Not his habit. But I just smiled and agreed, like the usual distracted wife. As soon as he left, I grabbed my purse and keys and called a car through the app. My destination was clear: follow the tracks left by his phone. I needed to confirm with my own eyes what I already knew deep down. My heart was pounding, a mix of fear and courage. During the drive, I stared out the window, trying to calm myself. Every corner felt like an endurance test. Every red light heightened my anxiety. I wasn't just chasing an address. I was chasing the truth that could dismantle the very foundations of my life. The car stopped discreetly a few houses before the building that had already appeared in the screenshots. I got out slowly, taking in the surroundings as if it were part of a movie scene. The place was simple, but it hid something that would change everything. My entire body trembled, but my eyes were fixed on that facade. I waited a few minutes until another car pulled up. And there he was, getting out with the same smile he wore when he walked home. It was frightening to see how naturally he played two different roles. He seemed light, carefree, as if the world were perfectly under his control. I followed his footsteps from afar, observing every detail. He entered the building without looking around, confident that no one would ever find out. Little did he know that at that moment his secrets were being watched by the woman he deceived most. The scene burned in my mind like fire. I stood there, standing on the sidewalk, breathing deeply. With every second, my mind conjured images of what could be happening inside. Muffled laughter, glasses of wine, hands clasped. It was painful to imagine, but it was inevitable. I had to face the raw, unfiltered reality. I felt tears burning my eyes, but I held them back. This was no place to cry. It was a place to memorize, to commit his movements, the time, the route to memory. I already had digital evidence, but now I had the image of him crossing that threshold. The betrayal was no longer suspected. It was a fact. I waited across the street, observing the routine of the building. People went up, down, greeted each other. He seemed like just another one among many. And that hurt me even more. I had been reduced to nothing, while he built a new life behind walls that didn't belong to me. My body begged to cross the street, go up to that apartment, and tear off his mask in front of everyone. But my mind said no, not yet. I needed more. I needed to wait, to collect each piece of the puzzle, because a hasty confrontation could cost me dearly. As I waited, I remembered a friend who always said, "Those who cheat think they'll never be caught." And that was exactly what I saw in him. The confidence of someone who believes they're untouchable, of someone who manipulates without realizing someone's watching closely. The irony was almost unbearable. After almost 2 hours, he emerged from the building. He looked different, his hair disheveled, his smile still plastered on. He grabbed his phone, sent a few quick messages, and called another car. I cowered so as not to be seen, but inside, the anger burned brighter than ever. I went home before him. I set the table and prepared lunch, as if nothing had happened. When he came in, he hugged me from behind, and I smelled that sweet scent again. I smiled on the outside, but inside, I was already shattered. My silence was my weapon. During the meal, he talked about his friends, about conversations he'd supposedly had. He made up stories so naturally that I seemed to believe them. I chewed slowly, each word sounding like poison. And at the same time, I thought, keep talking. You have no idea what I already know. That afternoon, while he dozed on the couch, I secretly grabbed his phone. It was password protected, but his smartwatch had already given me clues. I saw quick notifications from messaging apps, some unfamiliar names, nothing explicit, but enough to confirm there was much more hidden. I returned the device before he woke up. I went to my room, closed the door, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were no longer the same. I was no longer the naive woman who blindly believed. I was becoming a different version of myself, firmer, colder, more ruthless. The feeling of helplessness was turning into strategy. I knew I couldn't change the past, but I could decide how to react to the present. His every gesture, his every word, was now fuel for my resistance. And, above all, for my revenge. That night, when he came over to sleep, I closed my eyes, pretending to be at peace. Inside, my mind screamed. I didn't just want to survive this. I wanted to turn the tables. Because this wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about my dignity, my strength, my own story. And it was in that moment, with him sleeping beside me, that I realized there were still hidden secrets, evidence I needed to gather. The address was just the beginning. The real revelation was yet to come, and I needed to be ready to face the impact that could destroy much more than a marriage. The following week became a minefield of details. I woke up every day with my phone in hand, reviewing schedules and notifications from the previous day, jotting everything down in a notebook: time, address, excuse. Each line in that notebook was a step toward a truth I could no longer ignore. And the more I wrote, the more I felt I was moving from being a victim to becoming a strategist. I began frequenting the places he mentioned, feigning interest in activities that were never my own. I visited places he mentioned, observed people, cross-referenced information. A receipt from an expensive restaurant, a hotel reservation in his name. Everything was at odds with the alleged footballing. With each discovery, my focus grew. I was no longer seeking just proof for myself, but pieces that would paint a complete picture of betrayal. I spoke to a mutual friend, casually, as if not looking for anything specific. I asked about recent commitments and sensed hesitation in her answers. She mentioned a work dinner at a place I'd already seen recorded on receipts. Checking her social media, I found likes at odd times. The pieces began to fall into place, and I understood he was unfaithful, yes, but also calculating, believing he was protected. I collected screenshots of messages, even if incomplete. I saved receipts of flower deliveries to addresses I didn't recognize on a random Monday. I discovered public photos that, taken together, showed discrete encounters at impossible-to-explain times. Each new file was a cog added to the machinery of my revenge. It was clear no lie could withstand the solidity of that collection of evidence. As the evidence mounted, I began to reflect on the impact of an exposure. How would my children react? How would our families, our friends, react? There was shame, but also the need for justice. I knew I would need to exercise caution to protect the innocent, preserving them from the mess he had created. My priority was to dismantle the farce without destroying those who were blameless. It was then that I discovered a hotel reservation for the weekend. It was a pattern I already knew, repeated as if it were part of his secret routine. I made a copy of the confirmation, saved the location and time, and felt a strange sense of power. Knowing where he would be meant having the chance to face the truth head-on. But I wouldn't go alone. I would need witnesses to make everything unquestionable. I called 2 trusted friends. I showed them only part of the evidence: the Uber receipt, the reservation, a suspicious photo. They were indignant, shocked, but didn't hesitate to be by my side. For the first time since it all began, I felt I wasn't alone. That alliance gave me strength I hadn't imagined I needed. On the appointed day, I simulated a trip out of town and left the children with an aunt. I went to the hotel accompanied, every step planned. My friends positioned themselves discreetly, and I kept in touch with them every step of the way. When we walked together to the hallway to our room, the air seemed heavy. The silence was so thick it hurt my ears, as if the universe was waiting for the inevitable shock. When I opened the door with the key we'd found, the scene left no doubt. I saw his belongings scattered about, recognizable clothes, the perfume I'd smelled so many times permeating the air. My body reacted as if it had been shot through with an electric shock. It was the confirmation I needed. The betrayal wasn't just digital, it was physical, blatant. My friends discreetly recorded everything. I returned home in silence, my face hot and my soul torn, but with the definitive proof in my pocket. I didn't confront him that night. I prepared dinner, took care of the children, and let him act as usual. The secrecy of the hidden images gave me a paradoxical feeling: pain, but also power. I was no longer just a victim. I held the truth in my hands. The next day, I sent him a curt message. I showed him the Uber screenshot, the hotel reservation, a single photo. He responded desperately, denying it, blaming me for being suspicious, and even insinuating that I was to blame for the distancing. It was the same old manipulation, but this time it didn't work. I had cloud backups, witnesses, people who already knew. He had no way to silence me anymore. Little by little, the rumors began to circulate among acquaintances. The man who marketed himself as respectable at work was now the target of whispers and suspicious looks. Some colleagues distanced themselves, others sought direct explanations. The reputation he had built began to crumble, crumbling along with his image as an exemplary husband. And watching his mask fall was more than a relief. It was justice. At home, he tried to make amends with flowers, impromptu dinners, tears, and apologies. I listened to him silently, observing his repentance. When he placed the flowers on the table, I placed the printed evidence next to them: receipts, messages, screenshots. There was no room for dialogue, only facts against lies. He paled, stammered, and tried to turn the tables again, but there was no turning back. The news spread faster than I expected. Some friends walked away in shame, others stayed by my side, indignant. My mother asked if I was okay, and I answered in short sentences, sparing her the burden I carry. It was painful to realize the fragility of relationships, but also comforting to see who truly cared. So I sought legal advice. I wanted to know my rights. I wanted security for myself and my children. The lawyer explained how to record digital evidence, how to ensure authenticity, and protect my next steps. I made certified copies, stored them in safe places, and involved witnesses who pledged their allegiance. It was no longer just an emotional issue. It was a fight that would also go through the courts, if necessary. As social media adjusted to the scandal, I began to find myself again. I slept better the first nights in months, even with painful memories haunting my mind. I resumed morning walks, lunches with friends, small habits that previously seemed distant. I discovered that rebuilding doesn't happen in a single gesture, but in daily details, and every detail strengthened me. He lost his place at work, not immediately, but gradually. Colleagues questioned his absences, superiors noticed inconsistencies. The image of a trustworthy man quietly crumbled. None of it erased the damage done to me, but proving that the truth carried public weight gave me the strength to carry on. Finally, I realized the narrative was no longer in his hands. Still, victory came at a cost. I felt tired. I felt the weight of the emotional toll. I wondered if exposing everything was truly worth the pain that reverberated through so many. But when I saw my children smiling, hugging each other, I understood that protecting their peace was my greatest triumph. Everything I did was to ensure they wouldn't grow up amidst lies. On a silent afternoon, I sat on the porch with my phone in hand, reviewing every piece of evidence. The messages, the reservations, the photos, a heavy but necessary archive. I felt sadness for everything I'd lost, but also an unprecedented strength. I had regained control of my story. And as I closed the screen, I realized there were still hidden secrets, ready to emerge, and perhaps even more devastating than anything I'd already discovered. I woke to my phone vibrating and, reflexively, checked the incoming news. A new message from a colleague asking if I was okay. Someone had commented on my husband at work. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if each notification were a drop piercing an old wound. I took a deep breath and decided that every step I took from then on would have purpose. No more emotional chaos. Today I would need strategy and precision. I began delegating routine tasks to free up time without arousing suspicion. I arranged with my mother to pick up the children on different days and went to the notary's office just to learn how to document evidence. I learned basic legal terms, inquired about digital authenticity, and how to preserve a backup that couldn't be challenged. It was a war of patience and protocol, and I was determined to win it carefully. I set up a secure folder on my computer with all the evidence, each file labeled by date and time. I made physical copies and left one with a trusted friend out of town. Every receipt, every screenshot, every photo was cataloged as material evidence. It wasn't just revenge, it was protection for my future and that of my children. Feeling that control gave me back a bit of what had been taken from me. I observed his movements at work with discreet eyes I hadn't had before. I noticed absences from meetings, sudden departures for short coffees, and calls he answered quickly in the hallways. Colleagues exchanged glances, and one panicked when he saw me at the entrance to the floor. The web of lies he had built was beginning to show cracks, and I recorded everything like someone writing the script for a play he didn't notice. One morning, I found an old receipt hidden among office papers. It was from a restaurant in the same neighborhood as the suspicious fares. The amount was high for a work lunch, and there were items that clearly pointed to an intimate encounter. I kept the receipt carefully, as if it were a note that could open a cell. Everything fit together piece by piece. I went to the bank just to confirm transaction times and detected small transfers on specific days. They were amounts that sounded like payment for discrete encounters, one-off deposits that coincided with reservations and deliveries. It wasn't necessary to prove criminal intent. It was enough to demonstrate a pattern. I wrote everything down calmly and patiently, knowing that the truth doesn't need shouting to exist. It needs documentation. I spoke to his secretary, feigning concern about a corporate event he was supposedly coordinating. I casually asked about travel, schedules, and accommodations, and she confused details. The confusion seemed small, but it was a loophole. I began to realize how many everyday lies supported the grand deception. Each slip-up was a thread I would pull to the knot of the entire plot. One rainy afternoon, I decided to review old messages with the calm of someone reopening old wounds to heal them once and for all. I found an audio message he had mistakenly sent to a group, with a nervous laugh and a reference that would only make sense in the apartment in the suspect neighborhood. The audio was short but eloquent. However, on its own, it might not have been enough. I combined it with other evidence and felt the weight of certainty crush the final doubt. I started monitoring routes with the help of an app that showed me approximate car positions. I wasn't spying for pleasure, I was gathering facts. On 2 different weekends, the routes coincided with times when he said he was at a friend's house. I marked these times in my notebook with a red marker. It was amazing how the repetition created a definitive pattern. I asked a friend who works in photography to accompany me for a casual outing in the area where the building was located. We disguise curiosity as interest in stores and restaurants, and we observe corners and entrances. We saw a car that looked like his parked frequently at a similar time to the prince. We note signs, times, and departure details. It wasn't scene hunting, it was methodical evidence collection. One night, when reviewing and comparing everything, I realized that the betrayal had layers. There was the lover, yes, but also a network of small protections. Friendships that shielded him, colleagues that he would omit for convenience. This gave the dimension of the effort I was facing. The battle was not just against a man, it was against a social shield, and I was ready to take it apart, piece by piece. I decided to record an informal statement with a lawyer, describing the pattern, the emotional impact, and the risk to the children. The lawyer suggested discretionary measures to protect documents and a legal action plan if necessary. I left the office feeling like I was no longer alone. There was a legal path outlined there. This consolidated my stance. I was not looking for humiliation. I was looking for justice and security. Meanwhile, he tried to normalize life at home with dinners and empty praise. I accepted, but with a different attitude. Polite, distant, evaluating. It wasn't apathy, it was strategy. I let him speak. I documented his speech and the discrepancy with the facts I already knew. There was power in responding with calculated coolness rather than emotional outburst. My friends remained close, and at a controlled dinner, we agreed steps in case I needed immediate support. Having a network was vital, and I came to value every silent gesture that protected me. In one of these conversations, one of them suggested involving his boss if things developed. The mention of work made me think, reputation is also currency. And I already knew how much that currency could devalue. One morning, when I opened the refrigerator, I found an apology note written in handwriting I didn't recognize. It was short, emotional, like the ones you leave when you want to manipulate guilt. I kept the note and immediately noticed that the handwriting had lines similar to notes I saw in photos of the suspicious apartment. Small details gave me connections that previously seemed disconnected. The web was becoming clear. I started practicing short, to-the-point responses to potential confrontations. I trained my voice not to burst into tears. I prepared direct questions for the moment when I caught him without a doubt. Rehearsing didn't take the weight off, gave me control. And controlling the situation would be my best weapon against the inversion of blame that he always tried to apply. One Saturday afternoon, while he thought I was out, I accessed profiles I had previously ignored. I found deleted messages that, with simple recovery tools, resurfaced in parts. There were conversations that mentioned meetings, times, and even code names. It wasn't beautiful, it was cold, and each fragment restored a little of what I deserved to know. I documented everything with a date stamp. I began to observe my children's behavior without being noticed, taking care that the truth did not reach them in a traumatic way. I planned conversations with a child psychologist in case of objections or direct questions. My priority was to shield their innocence while I dismantled the deception. Protecting them gave meaning to all the sleepless nights and the pain I carried. A letter arrived at our address addressed to him with the name of another establishment. It was silent proof that other lives crossed paths there. I kept the letter like someone saving a trophy from a battle. Every detail, no matter how small, was fuel for the irrevocable decision I had made. I wouldn't back down from the signs. In the early hours of the morning, when the house fell silent, I reviewed everything again and felt that I was preparing for the final step. He had evidence, witnesses, and legal support. But there was something that bothered me: the fear of social stigma on children. I thought about how the exhibition could have an impact on their world. And it was this thought that gave me the moral clarity to act responsibly. That same morning, I received an anonymous call with new information: a common account in his name that paid for reservations in another name. It was the missing piece to financially connect the evidence. I wrote down the number, synced it with my spreadsheets, and felt the knot of truth tighten. All that was left now was to decide when and how to reveal. On Monday morning, I woke up with a weight on my chest that wasn't just physical. The phone, the receipts, the notes in the notebook seemed to surround me like guardians of the truth. I walked to the kitchen, prepared coffee, and looked at the door, knowing that in a few hours he would come out again to live his lie. The scene was repeated like a rehearsed theater. And now I was no longer a passive spectator. While he was getting ready, he made up banal excuses about appointments, meetings, and being late. I listened to him with forced serenity, mentally noting every word. His gaze no longer passed through me. It was as if he were talking to a wall. He still believed he had dominion over me. But every lie uttered was a confession burned into my memory. I decided that that week would be full observation, without interference. I started to notice details about the car, the perfume, the way he typed messages while hiding the screen. His hands shook at times, revealing a hidden nervousness. It was curious to see how safe he felt, but his body screamed otherwise. I just needed to be careful. At work, he sent short messages as always, but now I read between the lines. Long meeting. Heavy traffic. I'll be back late. The repetition was so predictable that it sounded comical. I imagined each apology being said to the other person, while sending off quick sentences. I wasn't just injured anymore. I was collecting ammunition. The friends who helped me were already on alert. We exchanged information like secret agents, planning every step. One of them managed to capture photos of his car parked again in the same neighborhood. Another, with discreet help, confirmed future reservations on his behalf. It was as if the net began to close without him noticing. At home, however, I maintained the role of calm wife. I prepared meals, smiled at dinners, participated in superficial conversations. He believed that I had retreated, that my suspicions had disappeared. But the truth is that I was stronger than ever. And this contrast between appearance and reality gave me power. One day, when going through a drawer, I found a small hidden jewelry package. The box had a delicate bracelet that I never received. I held the object and felt my heart squeeze. It was further confirmation that he lived two lives. I put it back, carefully, knowing that the moment to expose it would come. But the pain was inevitable. I started to imagine the conversations I would have with him. He rehearsed questions, anticipated answers. I was tired of hearing denials, of being called paranoid. This time, there would be no room for psychological games. I had too much evidence, too many witnesses, too much conviction. He couldn't turn me against myself again. In the evening, I sat alone on the porch with a glass of wine. I looked at the stars and thought about how my life had changed in such a short time. I was the same woman, but I no longer felt the same. He carried invisible scars, but also new strength. He didn't know it yet, but his role in my story was coming to an end. As the days went by, I noticed that he became bolder. He arrived later, answered calls in another language to confuse people, invented elaborate stories. I just watched, letting him believe he was safe. The game of solitaire was cruel but necessary. The greater his confidence, the greater the fall would be. A friend suggested we hire a detective. I seriously thought about the idea, but decided I already had enough evidence. I didn't need someone to confirm what I already knew. I just needed to choose the right moment to show everything. And that moment approached like a wave that could not be contained. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from an unknown number. The female voice on the other end hung up upon hearing mine. It was quick, nervous, almost like an accident. I kept the number and investigated discreetly. I discovered it was registered to an events company. The circle of lies became increasingly complex. At night, he approached, trying to cuddle, but I gently moved away. I said I was tired, and he believed me. But the truth was, I didn't want his touch anymore. My body rejected every gesture that was once intimate. It was like hugging a shadow, and I didn't want to be a prisoner of that darkness anymore. His smartwatch was still delivering signals to me. Calories burned at impossible times, records of accelerated heartbeat outside of any training. It all made up a silent narrative that he couldn't control. I read each piece of information as a confession he never imagined giving me. At a family dinner, I observed how he acted in front of others. He told jokes, talked about projects. He seemed like the perfect man. Everyone laughed, everyone believed. I was smiling too, but inside I was screaming. It was suffocating to see so many people deceived while I carried the truth alone. But this loneliness gave me even more determination. I decided to create a single file with all the evidence, impeccably organized. A dossier that could be opened at any time, in front of him, in front of his family, in front of whoever was necessary. It was my silent weapon, ready to be used when impact was inevitable. Deep down, however, I knew there was still one piece missing: hearing the confession from his mouth. As much as I had proof, I wanted to see the mask fall. I wanted to feel the weight of truth not just in the evidence, but in his eyes. That would be my final point, my catharsis. Every step I took brought me closer to that outcome. It was like walking down a dark road knowing that at the end there would be fire. And I no longer feared the flames. I was ready to cross them, even if they burned me. Because worse than the pain was continuing to live in a lie. In the early hours of the morning, I looked at him sleeping peacefully next to me. The face serene, the body surrendered to sleep. And I asked myself, how can anyone rest so peacefully after destroying so much? The answer came by itself, because he believed he would never be discovered. That would be his biggest mistake. And as the clock ticked 3 in the morning, a certainty took over me completely. It was time to expose every detail. The mask would fall before my eyes, and he would have nowhere to run. The game was set, and the revelation would be so devastating that it would change not just my life, but his forever. That Friday, I woke up determined to put into practice the confrontation I had been rehearsing in silence. I spent hours reviewing the evidence, like someone sharpening a blade before battle. Every print, every receipt, every photo was ammunition that he could never counter. The weight of the truth was in my hands, and I knew that when it was released, the impact would be irreversible. I waited for the right moment, the moment when he was too comfortable to be suspicious. He arrived home with a practiced smile, trying to convey normality. He placed his cell phone face down on the table as always. He prepared a hasty excuse about being late, as always. But I was ready to break the cycle. I served dinner in silence, watching his every move. The naturalness with which he invented stories made me nauseated. He ate slowly, laughing at made-up jokes as if nothing was happening. Inside, I no longer saw the man I shared my life with. I just saw a cheap actor trying to sustain a role that no longer fooled anyone. I waited until he relaxed on the couch, distracted by his cell phone. So I got up, put the notebook on the table, and opened the evidence folder. The images flashed on the screen like arrows fired straight at him. Uber prints, hotel reservations, messages, photos, each item displayed without words. The silence was deafening. He looked at the screen and, for a few seconds, remained motionless. Then the reaction came cascading. Denial, shock, anger. "That's not what you think," he said in a shaky voice. "You're misunderstanding." But the more he talked, the more the evidence contradicted him. With each sentence, his mask fell a little more. I tried to keep my voice steady despite my racing heart. He just said, "I'm not the one who needs to explain anything. It's the facts." He tried to get closer, touch my hands, but I backed away. For the first time, I saw terror in his eyes. I wasn't afraid of getting lost. I was terrified of losing the image I had in front of the world. With each new piece of evidence shown, he looked for different excuses. A business dinner, a run by chance, a friend in trouble. But everything sounded fragile, without consistency. I watched him get tangled up in his own lies, like a puppet cutting its own strings. The man who had always made me doubt myself was now drowning in his contradictions. At one point, he raised his voice, trying to reverse the situation. "You're stalking me. You're spying on me. This isn't healthy." Hearing that made me laugh inside. He, the traitor, accusing me of trespassing. But this time there was no room for manipulation. The truth was too clear to be erased with screams. His anger turned to despair. The once firm voice began to falter. Gestures, previously controlled, became abrupt and uncoordinated. I just watched him, with a cold serenity that left him even more disconcerted. He expected my outburst but met my calm, and that calm disarmed him. While he struggled, I continued to project the tests in sequence onto the screen. Every click was a blow. An Uber ride, a hotel photo, an intimate message. I didn't need to say anything. The screen spoke for me, and he knew there was no way out. After a few minutes, he threw himself onto the couch, exhausted, as if he had lost a battle he never imagined he would face. He remained silent, with his eyes fixed on the ground. I saw him smaller than ever. The arrogant, confident, controlling man, now cowering in the face of his own truth. And at that moment, I felt my pain begin to turn into strength. I took advantage of the silence and just said, "You destroyed trust, and without it, there is nothing." My words weren't screams, they were sentences. He looked at me as if seeking mercy, but there was no more room for mercy. I didn't want any more explanations. I just wanted the farce to fall completely. He then tried to change strategy. He begged, cried, said he was confused, that he didn't want to lose me. The dramatic theater was long, but I already knew every act of that play. I looked at him coldly and said, "Confused? You've planned every detail for months." It was the first time I saw real shame on his face. As he spoke, I realized I was no longer vulnerable. I was in control. His every tear sounded fake. Every desperate gesture seemed rehearsed. The weight I carried for months was now on his shoulders. And I wasn't in a hurry. I wanted him to feel every second of his own defeat. I got up and turned off the notebook, putting the material away again. He just said, "This is just the beginning." He stared at me, astonished, trying to decipher what I would do next. I didn't respond. Silence was my most powerful weapon. Leaving him without knowing the next step was the biggest punishment. That night we slept under the same roof, but in different worlds. He was restless, turning from side to side, a prisoner of fear. Me, firm, at peace with my decision. There was no more room for tears. There was only one clear path: move forward without looking back. The next day, he tried to act normally, as if nothing had happened. He prepared coffee, talked about trivialities, tried to make me smile. But the weight of what had been exposed hung in the air like a dense cloud. I observed every gesture and knew. He hadn't slept, he hadn't eaten, he hadn't breathed peacefully. The game had turned. The messages arriving on his cell phone began to decrease. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of caution. The digital silence was almost as revealing as the evidence. I knew that on the other side there was also someone panicking, and this network of fear spread, tightening its grip around him. In the afternoon, I sat alone and reviewed the dossier once again. I already had the silent confession I wanted, his expression, his eyes full of terror, his shrunken body. But a new desire grew inside me. I didn't just want to expose it to him. I wanted everyone to see. He wanted the farce to be destroyed in front of the society he was deceiving. And it was at that moment, in front of the illuminated screen, that I decided on my next step. I would no longer be silent. His downfall would not just be at home, but in public. Because those who betray don't just destroy a heart. It destroys the trust of everyone who believed in its image. And that image was about to be shattered into 1,000 pieces. The decision to take him to his public downfall was not made in the heat of anger. I knew I would need strategy, coolness, and organization so that nothing would be distorted later. I planned every detail like someone putting together a puzzle, with pieces that fit together perfectly. I called trusted friends, a lawyer, and even an acquaintance who worked in communications. I showed part of the dossier and explained that the exposure would not just be revenge, but an act of justice. On the chosen morning, I printed copies of the tests and prepared stamped envelopes. Inside them, I placed receipts, screenshots of conversations, Uber records, and hotel reservations. I also added a pen drive with everything digitized and authenticated by witnesses. Each file had a date, time, and location, with no room for questioning. It was meticulous work, ready to be delivered. I went to his company with firm steps, but with my heart racing. In the building, I registered the material delivery protocol directly with the responsible sector. The employee maintained professionalism, but was unable to hide the impact upon seeing the quantity of documents. I left there knowing that an irreversible process had begun. The silence in the corridor seemed to confirm that nothing would ever be the same again. Back home, I felt the weight of responsibility. It wasn't just about exposing his lie, it was about protecting my children and preserving my own reputation. I agreed with my friends how to deal with possible leaks and rumors. The rule was clear: always respond with facts, never with emotions. Discipline was the only way to not be swallowed by his manipulation. On the same day, I noticed the first signs of impact. He received a direct call from HR and returned home more tense than ever. He tried to hide it, but I saw the insecurity in every gesture. The next day, the call was even longer, and his voice was no longer the same. The confidence that had always sustained his theater began to crumble. My friends took turns supporting me. One took care of the children at critical moments. Another closely monitored every movement of the company. We received messages from people linked to him, asking for meetings and explanations. We maintained the line of defense. No emotional conversations, just documented facts. This cold discipline began to disarm any attempt by him to turn the tide. Days later, the first rumors emerged in his workplace. Colleagues whispered. Some moved away. Others approached trying to confirm the facts. The image of an exemplary man was tarnished. He tried to justify himself with speeches about stress and personal problems, but they sounded fragile. Internal protocols were already in place, and he could no longer control the narrative. I was approached by a local journalist who had already heard about the case. I limited myself to confirming that there was evidence and that an internal process was being analyzed. I didn't give sensational interviews. I preserved my children and stayed focused. This stance gave me credibility and made part of the public look at me with empathy. The silent support began to grow. Within his family, the shock was inevitable. Parents who always defended him started to avoid him. Close friends who had previously praised him began to move away. The social isolation didn't come from me, but from his own choices. The mask of a man of respect broke in front of everyone. I watched in silence with the serenity of someone who had already anticipated each step. The lawyer formalized a notification demanding responses within legal deadlines. Now there was no more room for improvisation or manipulation. The process was registered, documented, and supported by law. Every attempt at a bargain or excuse would be treated objectively. This destabilized him even more, because he could no longer escape with words. The children began to notice small changes at home. I sat down with them and explained in simple terms that some adults make mistakes, but that I would always be there to protect them. I maintained the routine of school, trips, and affection so that they wouldn't feel the weight of the storm. Protecting their childhood was my most important commitment. And that's what gave me the strength to endure the most difficult days. Of course, there was criticism. Some people accused me of exaggerating, of exposing too much. Others suggested that I had resolved everything in silence, behind closed doors. I took a deep breath and didn't give in. I just replied that I wasn't the one who created the lie, I just revealed it. Society protects masks, but I would no longer accept being their accomplice. He even tried to defend himself, asking for support from influential friends. Some supported him out of convenience, others remained neutral. But it was already too late. The narrative did not hold up in the face of the evidence. I clearly saw the isolation growing around him. The man who seemed untouchable was now alone. Meanwhile, I was in therapy and taking care of myself. I needed to organize my mind, process the pain, and transform everything into learning. I didn't want to just be a survivor. I wanted to be someone rebuilt. I discovered that external strength is only sustained when there is constant internal work. This was my way of making sure I didn't break down in the process. During a night of conversation with friends, I opened part of the dossier and showed previously unseen details. Their shock was immediate, but so was their support. We planned security measures, talk about possible retaliation, and reinforce the protection network. Knowing that I was not alone was the greatest weapon against fear, and this network would become vital in the days to come. At the company, he was called to a fact-finding committee. He gave a statement, tried to defend himself, but fell into obvious contradictions. The evidence was presented in chronological order, and there was no denying it. He left the room dejected, with his body bent and his face pale. The confident man I always knew was no more. At home, he still tried to negotiate. He talked about starting over, about couples therapy, about promises, but I no longer believed a single word. I refused any conversation that didn't pass through the legal filter. He realized there was no more room for manipulation. The door to reconciliation was forever locked. Messages began to arrive from other women, stories of similar betrayals, of silent manipulations, of well-constructed farces. Reading each report was like seeing my case reflected in different mirrors. I realized that my pain was not unique. It was part of a pattern. And this realization transformed my indignation into something greater: the desire to give other women a voice. One afternoon, I sat alone and reviewed the entire trajectory. The tears came, but not from pain. They were from relief. I had resisted, exposed, protected my children, and maintained my dignity. He hadn't just won an intimate battle. I had broken with a system of silence that so often protects traitors. It was more than personal. It was collective. At that moment, with my cell phone in my hand and the evidence stored in multiple places, I realized that there was still more to come. The truth had already caused profound damage, but the legal and social consequences were just beginning. And when the next wave came, I would be ready to bear its impact and let it finally be crushed by the weight of everything it had built against itself. His downfall wasn't just personal, it was social and legal. The man who previously presented himself as exemplary lost credibility at work, in friendships, and even in his own family. I, on the other hand, learned to transform pain into strategy, silence into trial, and weakness into strength. I rebuilt my life amidst the ruins, protecting my children and my dignity. The weight of the lie was no longer mine, it was his. I discovered that justice doesn't just happen in the courts, but also in exposing the truth. The masks he wore crumbled before everyone's eyes, and that was more devastating than any words of mine. The silence I maintained for months was replaced by organized evidence. The impact not only disarmed him, but also showed society who he really was. The lie did not resist the light. At the same time, I realized that my struggle was not isolated. Other women began to come to me with similar stories, echoes of betrayals hidden behind speeches of perfection. Their pain made me understand that my case was part of a larger pattern. I decided that my voice would not just be venting, but alert. Transforming suffering into prevention became my purpose. I protected my children with all my strength, explaining that the truth, even painful, is always necessary. I maintained their routine, provided emotional security, and showed that one adult's mistake does not define the entire family. This protection gave me strength to continue, because I realized that the biggest victory was seeing the intact trust in their eyes, and that was the legacy I wanted to leave. Today, when I look back, I don't just see betrayal. I see a woman who was reborn from her own suffering, who learned to trust herself and not accept less than she deserves. The story that seemed like an end became a beginning. And I leave 3 questions that resonate with everyone. And if it were you, what would you do? How many will still ignore the signs? Would you have the courage to reveal the truth, or would you prefer to live in a lie?